Section number 6, The History of the U.S., Part 3, The Union and National Politics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Scott. History of the United States by Charles A. Beard and Mary Ritter Beard, Part 3, Section 6. Chapter 9, The Jeffersonian Republicans in Power. Republican Principles and Policies. Opposition to strong central government, cherishing especially the agricultural interest. As Jefferson said, the Republicans were in the beginning provincial in their concern and outlook. Their attachment to America was, certainly, as strong as that of Hamilton, but they regarded the state, rather than the national government, as the proper center of power and affection. Indeed, a large part of the rank and file had been among the opponents of the Constitution in the days of its adoption. Jefferson had entertained doubts about it, and Monroe, destined to be the 5th president, had been one of the bitter foes of ratification. The former went so far in the direction of local autonomy that he exalted the state above the nation in the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, declaring the Constitution to be a mere compact and the states competent to interpret and nullify federal law. This was provincialism with a vengeance. It is jealousy, not confidence, which prescribes limited constitutions, wrote Jefferson for the Kentucky legislature. Jealousy of the national government, not confidence in it. This is the ideal that reflected the provincial and agricultural interest. Republican simplicity. Every act of the Jeffersonian party during its early days of power was in accord with the ideals of government which it professed. It had opposed all pomp and ceremony calculated to give weight and dignity to the chief executive of the nation, as symbols of monarchy and high prerogative. Appropriately, therefore, Jefferson's inauguration on March 4, 1801, the first at the new Capitol at Washington, was marked by extreme simplicity. In keeping with this procedure, he quit the practice, followed by Washington and Adams, of reading presidential addresses to Congress in joint assembly, and adopted in its stead the plan of sending his messages in writing, a custom that was continued unbroken until 1913, when President Wilson returned to the example set by the first chief magistrate. Republican measures. The Republicans had complained of a great national debt as the source of a dangerous money power, giving strength to the federal government. Accordingly, they began to pay it off as rapidly as possible. They had held commerce in low esteem and looked upon a large navy as a mere device to protect it. Consequently, they reduced the number of warships. They had objected to the excise taxes, particularly on whiskey. These they quickly abolished, to the intense satisfaction of the farmers. They had protested against the heavy cost of the federal government. They reduced expenses by discharging hundreds of men from the army and abolishing many offices. They had savagely criticized the sedition law, and Jefferson refused to enforce it. They had been deeply offended by the assault on freedom of speech and press, and they promptly impeached Samuel Chase, a justice of the Supreme Court, who had been especially severe in his attacks upon offenders under the Sedition Act. Their failure to convict Justice Chase by a narrow margin was due to no lack of zeal on their part, but to the Federalist strength in the Senate where the trial was held. They had regarded the appointment of a large number of federal judges during the last hours of Adams's administration as an attempt to entrench Federalists in the judiciary and to enlarge the sphere of the national government. Accordingly, they at once repealed the act creating the new judgeships, thus depriving the midnight appointees of their posts. They had considered the federal offices, civil and military, as sources of great strength to the Federalists, and Jefferson, though committed to the principle that offices should be open to all and distributed according to merit, was careful to fill most of the vacancies as they occurred with trusted Republicans. To his credit, however, it must be said that he did not make wholesale removals to find room for party workers. The Republicans thus hewed to the line of their general policy of restricting the weight, dignity, and activity of the national government. Yet there were no Republicans, as the Federalists asserted, prepared to urge serious modifications in the Constitution. "If there be any among us who wish to dissolve this Union or to change its Republican form," wrote Jefferson in his first inaugural, "let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." After reciting the fortunate circumstances of climate, soil, and isolation which made the future of America so full of promise, Jefferson concluded, "A wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities." In all this, the Republicans had not reckoned with destiny. In a few short years that lay ahead, it was their fate to double the territory of the country, making inevitable a continental nation, to give the Constitution a generous interpretation that shocked many Federalists, to wage war on behalf of American commerce, to reestablish the hated United States Bank, to enact a high protective tariff, to see their Federalist opponents in their turn discredited as nullifiers and provincials, to announce high national doctrines in foreign affairs, and to behold the Constitution exalted and defended against the pretensions of states by a son of old Virginia, John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. The Republicans and the Great West. Expansion and land hunger. The first of the great measures which drove the Republicans out upon this new national course, the purchase of the Louisiana territory, was the product of circumstances rather than of their deliberate choosing. It was not the lack of land for his cherished farmers that led Jefferson to add such an immense domain to the original possessions of the United States. In the Northwest Territory, now embracing Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a portion of Minnesota, settlements were mainly confined to the north bank of the Ohio River. To the south, in Kentucky and Tennessee, where there were more than 100,000 white people who had pushed over the mountains from Virginia and the Carolinas, there were still wide reaches of untilled soil. The Alabama and Mississippi regions were vast Indian frontiers of the state of Georgia, unsettled and almost unexplored. Even to the wildest imagination there seemed to be territory enough to satisfy the land hunger of the American people for a century to come. The significance of the Mississippi River. At all events, the East, then the center of power, saw no good reason for expansion. The planters of the Carolinas, the manufacturers of Pennsylvania, the importers of New York, the shipbuilders of New England, looking to the seaboard and to Europe for trade, refinements, and sometimes their ideas of government, were slow to appreciate the place of the West in national economy. The better educated the Easterners were, the less, it seems, they comprehended the destiny of the nation. Sons of Federalist fathers at Williams College, after a long debate, decided by a vote of 15-1 that the purchase of Louisiana was undesirable. On the other hand, the pioneers of Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, unlearned in books, saw with their own eyes the resources of the wilderness. Many of them had been across the Mississippi and had beheld the rich lands awaiting the plow of the white man. Down the great river they floated their wheat, corn, and bacon to ocean-going ships bound for the ports of the seaboard or for Europe. The land journeys over the mountain barriers with bulky farm produce, they knew from experience, were almost impossible and costly at best. Nails, bolts of cloth, tea, and coffee could go or come that way, but not corn and bacon. A free outlet to the sea by the Mississippi was as essential to the pioneers of the Kentucky region as the harbor of Boston to the merchant princes of that metropolis. Louisiana under Spanish rule. For this reason, they watched with deep solicitude the fortunes of the Spanish king, to whom, at the close of the 7 Years' War, had fallen the Louisiana territory stretching from New Orleans to the Rocky Mountains. While he controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, there was little to fear, for he had neither the army nor the navy necessary to resist any invasion of American trade. Moreover, Washington had been able, by the exercise of great tact, to secure from Spain in 1795 a trading privilege through New Orleans which satisfied the present requirements of the frontiersmen, even if it did not allay their fears for the future. So things stood when a swift succession of events altered the whole situation. Louisiana transferred to France. In July 1802, a royal order from Spain instructed the officials at New Orleans to close the port to American produce. About the same time, a disturbing rumor long current was confirmed. Napoleon had coerced Spain into returning Louisiana to France by a secret treaty signed in 1800. "The scalers of the Alps and conquerors of Venice," now looked across the sea for new scenes of adventure. The West was ablaze with excitement. A call for war ran through the frontier. Expeditions were organized to prevent the landing of the French, and petitions for instant action flooded in upon Jefferson. Jefferson sees the danger. Jefferson, the friend of France and sworn enemy of England, compelled to choose in the interest of America, never winced. "The secession of Louisiana and the Floridas by Spain to France," he wrote to Livingston, the American minister in Paris, "works sorely on the United States. It completely reverses all the political relations of the United States, and will form a new epoch in our political course. There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market. France, placing herself in that door, assumes to us an attitude of defiance. Spain might have retained it quietly for years. Her pacific dispositions, her feeble state, would induce her to increase our facilities there. Not so can it ever be in the hands of France. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans fixes the sentence which is to restrain her forever within her low water mark. It seals the union of the two nations who in conjunction can maintain exclusive possession of the ocean. From that moment we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. This is not a state of things we seek or desire. It is one which the measure, if adopted by France, forces on us as necessarily as any other cause, by the laws of nature, brings on its necessary effect." Louisiana purchased. Acting on this belief, but apparently seeing only the Mississippi outlet at stake, Jefferson sent his friend, James Monroe, to France with the power to buy New Orleans and West Florida. Before Monroe arrived, the regular minister, Livingston, had already convinced Napoleon that it would be well to sell territory which might be wrested from him at any moment by British sea power, especially as the war, temporarily stopped by the Peace of Amiens, was once more raging in Europe. Wise as he was in his day, Livingston had at first no thought of buying the whole Louisiana country. He was simply dazed when Napoleon offered to sell the entire domain and get rid of the business altogether. Though staggered by the proposal, he and Monroe decided to accept. On April 30, they signed the Treaty of Cession, agreeing to pay $11,250,000 in 6% bonds, and to discharge certain debts due French citizens, making in all approximately 15 millions. Spain protested. Napoleon's brother fumed. French newspapers objected, but the deed was done. Jefferson and his constitutional scruples. When the news of this extraordinary event reached the United States, the people were filled with astonishment, and no one was more surprised than Jefferson himself. He had thought of buying New Orleans and West Florida for a small sum, and now a vast domain had been dumped into the lap of the nation. He was puzzled. On looking into the Constitution, he found not a line authorizing the purchase of more territory, and so he drafted an amendment declaring, "Louisiana, as ceded by France, a part of the United States." He had belabored the Federalists for piling up a big national debt, and he could hardly endure the thought of issuing more bonds himself. In the midst of his doubts came the news that Napoleon might withdraw from the bargain. Thoroughly alarmed by that, Jefferson pressed the Senate for a ratification of the treaty. He still clung to his original idea that the Constitution did not warrant the purchase, but he lamely concluded, "If our friends shall think differently, I shall certainly acquiesce with satisfaction, confident that the good sense of our country will correct the evil of the construction when it shall produce ill effects." Thus the stanch advocate of "strict interpretation" cut loose from his own doctrine, and entrusted the construction of the Constitution to "the good sense" of his countrymen. The treaty ratified. This unusual transaction, so favorable to the West, aroused the ire of the seaboard Federalists. Some denounced it as unconstitutional, easily forgetting Hamilton's masterly defense of the bank, also not mentioned in the Constitution. Others urged that if "the howling wilderness" ever should be settled, it would turn against the East, form new commercial connections, and escape from federal control. Still others protested that the purchase would lead inevitably to the dominance of a "hodgepodge of wild men from the far West." Federalists who thought "the broad back of America" could readily bear Hamilton's consolidated debt, now went into agonies over a bond issue of less than 1/6 of that amount. But in vain. Jefferson's party, with a high hand, carried the day. The Senate, after hearing the Federalist protest, ratified the treaty. In December 1803, the French flag was hauled down from the old government buildings in New Orleans, and the stars and stripes were hoisted as a sign that the land of Coronado, De Soto, Marquette, and La Salle had passed forever to the United States. By a single stroke, the original territory of the United States was more than doubled. While the boundaries of the purchase were uncertain, it is safe to say that the Louisiana territory included what is now Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and large portions of Louisiana, Minnesota, North Dakota, Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. The farmlands that the friends of "a little America" on the seacoast declared a hopeless wilderness were, within 100 years, fully occupied and valued at nearly $7 billion, almost 500 times the price paid to Napoleon. Western explorations. Having taken the fateful step, Jefferson wisely began to make the most of it. He prepared for the opening of the new country by sending the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore it, discover its resources, and lay out an overland route through the Missouri Valley and across the Great Divide to the Pacific. The story of this mighty exploit, which began in the spring of 1804 and ended in autumn of 1806, was set down with skill and pains in the Journal of Lewis and Clark. When published, even in short form, it invited the forward-looking men of the East to take thought about the Western Empire. At the same time, Zebulon Pike, in a series of journeys, explored the sources of the Mississippi River and penetrated the Spanish territories of the far Southwest. Thus, scouts and pioneers continued the work of diplomats. End of Section 6, recorded by Robert Scott, July the 10th, 2007.